Hi everyone, today I'm going to be familiarizing you with FERPA. It's a term that we've all heard before, but I wanted to go a little bit more in depth of the do's and don'ts, as well as provide some tips for educators, as well as our parents and adult age students. So adult age students are over the age of 18, and I will also be talking about our own Payola Panther board policies in regards to student privacy. So, what is FERPA? The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, also known as FERPA, is a federal law that protects the privacy of student education records maintained by or on behalf of educational agencies, school districts, and institutions, public elementary and secondary schools, and post-secondary institutions. So it really just boils down to the private information within a student's educational records that we'll be talking about FERPA covering. That being said, education records include students' name and address, as well as the name and addresses of parents and family members. So that differs from directory information, which I'll talk more about here in a little bit. It includes personal identifiers such as Social Security number or student numbers. It includes personal characteristics or other information that would make the student's identity easily traceable. Indirect identifiers such as the student's date or place of birth and mother's maiden name, and all of these examples are personally identifiable information, also known as PII. So if I say PII, then that's what I'm talking about when I talk about that. So continuing, FERPA prevents disclosure of information from a student's education record, but doesn't prevent disclosure of directory information. So I hinted at that in the last slide, but I'm going to go over what directory information is. So directory information is personally identifiable information, PII, that is not generally considered harmful if disclosed. Okay, so this includes like a student's name, or their grade level, or their birth date, or just basic information in general. Okay, there's a lot on this slide, but there's a lot that FERPA covers, so I'll just break it down for you. So FERPA does cover, it does require schools and districts as well as state educational agencies, also known as SEA, and their components to provide parents and eligible students with the opportunity to inspect and review the student's own education records. So they have all access to their education records at any time to look at them, to request changes, whatever the case may be. FERPA also requires that third-party agreements or contracts specify that the PII must be destroyed when no longer needed or when the school official relationship is terminated. So when a third party no longer needs the information, they need to destroy it or get rid of it correctly. FERPA also permits school districts to disclose student information if it is in compliance with a judicial order or lawfully issued subpoena, or in connection with a health or safety emergency, and in connection with a student engaged in a crime of violence or sex offense. So really just cases of emergency or different instances that might potentially affect other students around them or themselves. FERPA does not specify how or when to destroy or dispose of PII. That being said, it does offer some suggestions. It's basically off of a risk factor. So if it's extremely sensitive information, then they do require more in-depth disposal and destruction of the PII. But if it's low risk information, then it just requires less of an extensive process of destroying or disposing of the PII. So disposal and destruction methods depend on the data type, risk of disclosure, and the impact if that data were to be disclosed without authorization. And it requires that an end date be specified, but it does not specify a maximum time limit. So again, with those third-party contracts, it does specify that there needs to be an end date, so they can terminate whatever information they have, but it doesn't require a specific time limit for the contract. FERPA also does not automatically grant access to ICE personnel unless there's a legally mandated basis for their actions. So in other words, if there's a student that potentially might be undocumented, they're not really sure, ICE can't just come in and request those a student's education records unless they have a mandated basis for their action. Also, FERPA does not always protect against cyber threats, including ransomware and data theft. So it's really important that we are taking every precaution we can when it comes to electronically based storage of information. And FERPA does not protect homeschool students' records, and it does not give individuals the right to sue the school. If they feel that there is a need, that there was a violation of FERPA, then they go to the Department of Education, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. So, some recent amendments to FERPA. They've added biometric record as a personal identifier, so it could be a fingerprint or a scan of your face, so that adds to their education record. When under the Campus Sex Crimes Prevention Act, an institution discloses information about sex offenders or other individuals required to register under the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, commonly called the Wetterling Act. So that being said, again, whenever there are instances where there are exceptions to FERPA, it's really about the safety of the individuals around the student or the safety of the student themselves. So under the Sex Crime Prevention Act, they have to disclose the information about if they are a sex offender or if there are sex offenders around them. Another amendment is that you must allow authorized representatives to access private student data for user in statewide longitudinal data systems, SLDS. So that just goes for different data collection in regards to measuring student success as well as just the district as a whole. And then parents of adult age children can receive information from education records when the health or safety of the student or another person is threatened. When under the USA Patriot Act, the United States Attorney, during the course of a terrorism investigation, obtains an ex parte court order that is an order issued without notice to the subject. So again, if it's threatening the safety of students around said student or the student itself, then there are different ways of addressing FERPA or kind of loopholes of FERPA, if you will. And then last but not least, an amendment is that FERPA must recognize that a student may be identified even without disclosure of a specific data point. So that being said, again, it's just always lean more on the cautious side, even though we might think it is information that could be disclosed. Sometimes those identifiers might be a little bit more specific without us realizing it, and we have to make sure that we are just being cautious. And then a quote, a 2008 Federal Commission on School Safety report claims that FERPA has become out of touch with modern classrooms in digital age. So this segues into how the digital age in modern classroom has been impacted by these recent amendments. Changes with technology and the impact of the modern classroom. One thing that I do, and I know that I need to be better at sometimes, is my email communication. Although it's not illegal, email communication is not the most secure method of communication. That being said, whenever I do email regarding a student or information about a student, it is always just in between coworkers or other school officials. So it's not something that I share outside of our school. Digital record keeping. Students generate enormous amounts of sensitive electronic data about themselves every day. Whenever we use a free app or just a paid app, really, they enter their email. Sometimes they have to enter their address. Sometimes they have to add a picture. So all of our record keeping has really gone digital, and so that puts students at the risk of potentially giving third-party companies or agencies access to their personal information. And then data destruction. Since we've gone digital, data recovery techniques and technology are highly advanced. So if the information is highly sensitive, hardware and software techniques are needed to completely clean the hard disk containing PII. Again, this goes back to the overall risk of disclosure, meaning that if it is highly sensitive information, you have to do a more thorough, deep cleaning of the information once it has been used or once it has exceeded its time. And here are some violations going off of that. If parents or eligible students believe that their rights under FERPA have been violated, they may file a complaint with the Department of Education. Often the most effective response to these complaints will involve assisting the educational agency or institution to improve its policies, practices, and security protocols to prevent future incidents. So it's not just a slap on the wrist, it's how can we help you make sure that we can keep our students safe, which is really awesome. And then only in instances where an educational agency or institution is unwilling or unable to come into voluntary compliance. So if they get that slap on the wrist and then the Department of Education helps them adapt and modify their policies and practices, then they will lose federal funds, essentially. Okay, and now some tips for educators. Always choose third-party vendors that will comply with FERPA or are already complying with FERPA or are willing to revise all existing agreements to ensure that the vendor understands their duty to comply. So just make sure you're on the same page with your third-party vendors. Make sure all school employees are trained on FERPA. I really like this point, including requirements specific to your school. That's something that I really wish our school would do a little bit of a better job of. And then encrypt files and emails if communicating with PII personally. And then establish protocols for maintaining surveillance, equipment, and retaining records and apply them consistently. And last but not least, know when to release and withhold records, including on social media. Okay, and then some tips for parents and adult age students. Make sure that you read everything that is sent home with your child from school or sent in the mail. Always question why information about the student is being requested. Don't just assume that it's something you're already aware of. So always be kind of skeptical. Take advantage of opt-outs if you're uncomfortable or unsure. Find out if programs such as sport and music activities have websites in which participating students are named and pictured. So if you don't want their name and picture, make sure that you contact the head of whatever department you need to, whether it's the music department or maybe it's a coach, to make sure that your student is not pictured or their name is not present. And then review your child's education record periodically. You have the right to do that, and you should. And then document any violations or suspected violations. Just making sure that you have documentation of that will definitely help your case if you ever decide to file a complaint with the Department of Education. And then for Paola's student privacy policy, currently our privacy policy states that unless an adult student or parent or guardian of a minor student provides written consent to disclose personally identifiable student data, so that PII, student data may only be disclosed to a governmental entity not specified above or any public or private audit and evaluation or research organization if the data is aggregate data. Okay, so that's just a whole bunch of words, so making sure that your third-party vendors comply with FERPA, like I mentioned on the last slide. Aggregate data means data collected or reported at the group, cohort, or institutional level, and which contains no personally identifiable student data. So just making sure that, again, everyone's on the same page and everyone is willing to make changes if needed to comply with FERPA. And then here are all of my references, including the Paola board policies and my credits for this presentation.